In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that even the most hardened warriors of the Imperium would consider worse than death. To be captured by the enemy is one such fate, but when that enemy is a horde of savage orcs, and when the prisoner is not merely a space marine, but a dreadnought of the Alpha Legion, the situation becomes something altogether more nightmarish. This is not simply a tale of capture and imprisonment. This is the story of what happens when the galaxy's most cunning traitor legion meets its end in the hands of its most unpredictable and brutal foe. Picture this. Somewhere in the contested zones of the galaxy, a towering war machine stands motionless on a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of war. This is not just any dreadnought. This is a Contemptor pattern chassis, bearing the Hydra symbols of the Alpha Legion, ancient and deadly, containing within its armored sarcophagus a warrior who has served since the days of the Horus heresy. The machine's weapons have fallen silent, its power core damaged, its systems failing. Around it, a tide of green-skinned warriors surge forward, their bellowing war cries shaking the very ground. The Orks have won this engagement, and they have claimed a prize beyond their wildest dreams. For most Space Marine chapters, the capture of a dreadnought would be a tragedy of the highest order. These walking tombs contain some of the most venerated heroes of their chapters, warriors whose sacrifice and service have earned them a kind of immortality. But this is no ordinary dreadnought, and the Alpha Legion are no ordinary Space Marines. What makes this scenario particularly fascinating and particularly horrifying is the collision of two vastly different philosophies of war. On one side, we have the Alpha Legion, masters of deception, infiltration, and long-term planning, whose operatives are trained to manipulate and mislead from the moment they first draw breath. On the other, we have the Orks, creatures of pure violence and instinct, whose approach to warfare is as straightforward as it is devastating. Before we can truly understand the nightmare that awaits our imprisoned warrior, we must first understand what a dreadnought truly is. These are not simply mechanical suits of armor or robotic war machines. They are something far more intimate and far more terrible. When a Space Marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology cannot save them, when their body is broken beyond all hope of recovery, the chapter faces a choice. They can allow their brother to die with honor, to join the Emperor in whatever lies beyond, or they can preserve him in a half-life of service that may span millennia. The process of interment is as brutal as it is sacred. The dying warrior's shattered body is encased in a cybernetic sarcophagus, a metal womb filled with amniotic fluid that keeps what remains of their flesh alive. Neural interface cables are driven directly into their brain and spinal column, creating an absolute link between the warrior's consciousness and the mechanical body that will become their new form. The Marine's mind becomes the operating system for tons of adamantium and ceramite, their thoughts translated into the movement of massive limbs and the firing of devastating weapons. They can no longer feel the touch of a brother's hand or taste the victory feast. They exist in a cold darkness, their only sensations coming through mechanical sensors, their only purpose to serve in endless war. For most dreadnoughts, this existence is managed through long periods of stasis sleep. The psychological strain of being permanently entombed in a metal shell is immense, and so when not needed for battle, these ancient warriors are allowed to slumber in the halls of their fortress monasteries. But even this mercy has its price. Each awakening becomes more disorienting. Each return to consciousness, a jarring transition from the void of sleep to the harsh reality of their mechanical existence. Memories fade over the centuries. The faces of fallen brothers become indistinct. The reasons for fighting, once so clear and noble, blur into a simple compulsion to serve. Many dreadnought pilots gradually lose their humanity, becoming more machine than man with each passing decade. Now imagine this already grim existence, complicated by the nature of the Alpha Legion itself. These are not warriors who seek glory in straightforward battle. They are not the noble champions of the Imperial fists or the fierce berserkers of the Space Wolves. The Alpha Legion operates in shadows, their greatest victories achieved through manipulation and misdirection. Even their dreadnoughts are different from those of other legions. Where a Blood Angel's dreadnought might be awakened to lead glorious charges into the heart of the enemy, an Alpha Legion dreadnought might spend decades pretending to be a relic of a loyalist chapter, gathering intelligence and sowing confusion. The warriors interred in these machines are not just veteran fighters, but master infiltrators, their minds trained in the art of deception from before the heresy. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare is built on layers within layers of misdirection. They rarely attack directly when subterfuge will serve. They plant false information, corrupt enemy communications, and turn allies against each other. Their battle plans often span years or even decades, with moves made in preparation for conflicts that have not yet begun. This makes them one of the most dangerous of the traitor legions, because you never truly know if you are fighting the Alpha Legion, or if you have already lost to them without realizing it. Their operatives can be anyone, anywhere. Even their Primarch, Alpharius, had a twin, Omegon, and both encouraged their warriors to claim the name Alpharius for themselves, creating a legion where individual identity meant nothing and deception was everything. For a warrior of such a legion to be interred in a dreadnought is to gain a terrible kind of freedom. The physical limitations of the flesh are replaced by the power of the machine, but the mind remains sharp, trained in all the arts of manipulation and strategy that define the Alpha Legion. These dreadnoughts are not simply weapons to be deployed. They are intelligence assets, master strategists who can see patterns and possibilities that others might miss. They remember battles fought 10,000 years ago with perfect clarity, and they can use that knowledge to devastating effect. An Alpha Legion dreadnought on the battlefield is never just a walking tank. It is a nexus of tactical planning, a commander who can coordinate complex operations while simultaneously engaging in direct combat. But all of this makes the scenario of capture by Orks even more perverse. The Orks are, in many ways, the Alpha Legion's opposite. Where the Alpha Legion plans for years, Orks charge in with gleeful abandon. Where the Alpha Legion hides their strength, Orks broadcast theirs through sheer noise and violence. Where the Alpha Legion uses deception, Orks use brutal honesty delivered through crude weapons and cruder tactics. They are a race of warriors genetically engineered for combat, creatures who reproduce through spores and live only for the joy of a good fight. They have no concept of peace or negotiation. They do not understand fear as other races do. And most importantly for our scenario, they have an instinctive understanding of technology that borders on the supernatural. The Orks' relationship with technology is one of the strangest aspects of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They are not stupid, despite their crude appearance and brutal behavior. In fact, certain Orks called mech boys have an innate, genetically encoded understanding of engineering and mechanics. They can look at a pile of scrap metal and instinctively know how to turn it into a functional vehicle or weapon. Their creations should not work. By all the laws of physics and engineering, Ork technology is too crude, too poorly designed, too slapped together to function properly. And yet it does work, because Orks possess a latent psychic field that they generate collectively, what they call the War. This field literally makes their beliefs reality. If enough Orks believe something will work, it will work. If they believe red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles do go faster, at least when Orks are driving them. This makes mech boys incredibly dangerous, especially when they get their hands on enemy technology. They do not just copy what they see, they adapt it, transform it, make it Orky. Imperial tanks become looted wagons bristling with additional guns and covered in crude armor plating. Enemy weapons are stripped down and rebuilt into something that should explode in the user's hands, but somehow functions just fine when wielded by an Ork. And when a mech boy gets hold of something really advanced, something like a Space Marine dreadnought, the possibilities become both endless and terrifying. Imagine being the pilot of that Alpha Legion Dreadnought. You have served your legion for perhaps 5,000 years, perhaps 10. You have fought in countless battles across countless worlds. You have seen the rise and fall of empires. You have orchestrated the downfall of entire planetary governments through nothing more than whispered rumors and planted evidence. Your mind is a labyrinth of plots within plots, strategies built on strategies. And now you find yourself immobilized, your power core damaged, your systems failing, watching through your optical sensors as a horde of green-skinned brutes closes in around you. The first moments of capture would be chaos. Orks do not take prisoners in any organized fashion. They simply grab what looks interesting and drag it back to their camps. In this case, the interesting thing is a multi-ton walking war machine that has been killing their warriors by the dozen. The Orks would approach with a mixture of caution and excitement. Some would poke at the chassis with crude tools, trying to determine if it is still dangerous. Others would immediately begin arguing about who gets to claim it, because among Orks, the right of ownership goes to whoever is biggest and meanest enough to take it. There would probably be several fights breaking out right there on the battlefield, as different Orks tried to establish dominance over this prize. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot would be experiencing something that few Alpha Legion warriors have ever known: helplessness. They cannot move their massive mechanical limbs. Their weapon systems are non-responsive. They can see and hear through their external sensors, but they cannot act. For a warrior trained to always have multiple backup plans, always have an escape route, this would be psychologically devastating. But this is still an Alpha Legion Dreadnought. Even in capture, even helpless, their mind would be working. They would be observing everything, cataloging the Orks' behavior, looking for patterns, searching for any opportunity to exploit. The Dreadnought would eventually be dragged back to the Ork camp, a process that would involve chains, multiple vehicles, and probably the death of several Orks who got too close to sharp edges or unstable footing. Ork camps are not neat military installations. They are chaotic sprawls of ramshackle buildings, constantly smoking forges and piles of salvaged junk. The air would be thick with the smell of promethium exhaust, burning metal, and Ork body odor, which is considerable. The noise would be constant and deafening, a cacophony of shouting Orks, clanging metal, and explosions from mech workshops where experiments have gone catastrophically wrong. The Dreadnought would likely be dumped in or near a mech's workshop, and this is where things would begin to get truly nightmarish for the imprisoned pilot. Ork mech boys are not gentle or cautious. They do not understand concepts like care or preservation. When they want to know how something works, they take it apart, usually with hammers and cutting torches. The fact that there is a living being inside the Dreadnought would not necessarily stop them. In fact, it would probably make them more curious. The first attempts to breach the sarcophagus would be brutal and direct. Mech boys would attack it with every tool at their disposal. Power claws would scrape across the armored shell, leaving deep gouges but not penetrating. Cutting torches would be applied to seams and joints, heating the metal to temperatures that the pilot inside would feel even through their life support systems. The sarcophagus is designed to protect its occupant from battlefield conditions, but it was not designed to withstand hours of sustained assault by creatures who view patience as a weakness and subtlety as boring. During this process, the pilot would be aware of everything happening to their mechanical body. Remember, the neural connection between a Dreadnought pilot and their chassis is absolute. When Ork tools bite into the armor, the pilot would register it not as an abstract damage report, but as something approaching actual sensation, a pressure, a violation of the body that is now both metal and flesh. The temperature fluctuations as cutting torches are applied would be translated through their mechanical senses as an oppressive, suffocating heat. And all the while, they would hear the Orks, their guttural language, their arguments, their excited chattering about this new toy they have found. But Ork mech boys are not stupid, despite their crude methods. They would eventually realize that brute force alone is not going to be enough to crack this particular nut. This is when they would bring in specialists. Among the Orks, there are not only mech boys but also pain boys, the Ork equivalent of doctors and surgeons. Pain boys have the same instinctive understanding of biology that mech boys have of machinery. They can keep Orks alive through injuries that would kill any other species. They can sew limbs back on, transplant organs from one body to another, and augment Ork warriors with crude bionics. And they would be very interested in the living being they can detect inside this metal shell. The combination of a big mech and a pain boy working together on the Dreadnought would be a sight to chill the blood of any space marine. The mech would be trying to understand the mechanical systems, while the pain boy would be trying to get at the biological component. They would work in their typical Ork fashion, which is to say with enthusiasm, creativity, and absolutely no concern for the suffering of their subject. Drills would be used to create pilot holes through the armor. Crude sensor equipment, some of it looted from Imperial sources and badly misunderstood, would be jammed into these holes to try to determine what was inside. For the Alpha, Legion pilot, this would be a special kind of torture. They are a master strategist, someone who has outsmarted planetary governors and space marine captains alike. And now they are being treated like a particularly interesting puzzle box by creatures whose idea of advanced planning is deciding which direction to attack from. The physical pain would be considerable, as each probe and drill creates new violations of their sarcophagus. But the psychological pain would be worse. This is a warrior who has spent centuries in service to a legion that values cunning above all else, and there is no cunning that can save them from simple, brutal, methodical Ork curiosity. Eventually, the Orks would find a way in. Perhaps they would manage to cut through a seal, or perhaps they would simply hit the right combination of buttons and levers through pure trial and error. The moment the sarcophagus is breached, the amniotic fluid that sustains the pilot's life would begin to leak out, and with it would come the first real glimpse of what lies within. The Orks would see the withered, atrophied form of what was once a space marine, their body reduced to little more than a torso and head, covered in cables and tubes, more machine than flesh. The sight would probably make them pause, not out of horror or sympathy, but out of confusion. This is what was piloting this massive war machine, this weak, broken thing. The pain boy would immediately want to examine this strange specimen more closely. Space marine physiology is fascinating to any student of biology, even one as crude as an Ork pain boy. The extra organs, the enhanced bone structure, the secondary heart, all of these would be subjects of intense interest. And unlike a normal space marine prisoner, who might have some ability to resist or fight back, the Dreadnought pilot is completely helpless outside their mechanical shell. They cannot even move their withered limbs without assistance. They are, in the most literal sense, at the mercy of their captors. This is where the true nightmare begins for our Alpha Legion warrior. Ork pain boys do not understand concepts like consent or anesthesia. When they want to study something, they simply cut it open and look. The examination of a Space Marine Dreadnought pilot would be thorough, painful, and conducted with all the delicacy of a child pulling the legs off an insect. Organs would be prodded and poked, bones would be tested for strength. The various augmentations and implants that mark a Space Marine would be examined with crude instruments and cruder techniques. Through it all, the pilot would be conscious, aware, able to feel every violation, but unable to do anything to stop it. But our Alpha Legion warrior is not simply enduring this torment passively. Remember, these are among the most devious and manipulative warriors in the galaxy. Even strapped to an Ork operating table, even being literally taken apart piece by piece, their mind would be working. They would be listening to the Orks, learning their language, understanding their hierarchy. They would be looking for weaknesses, for rivalries, for anything that could be exploited. The Alpha Legion's motto is, "I am Alpharius," a reminder that they are all trained to think and act like their Primarch. to be master infiltrators and manipulators. Being a prisoner does not change this fundamental nature. The pilot would start subtle. A word dropped here, a suggestion made there. Orks are surprisingly susceptible to manipulation if you understand their psychology. They respect strength and cunning, and they love a good fight. The pilot might suggest to one mech that another mech is trying to steal credit for discoveries made about the Dreadnought. They might plant the idea that the Dreadnought could be made to work again, but only with the help of the smartest mech around. They might even claim to be willing to help, to share the secrets of their war machine, in exchange for better treatment or a specific favor. It would not be enough to secure their freedom, not at first, but it might be enough to introduce chaos into the Ork camp, to set different factions against each other. Meanwhile, the mech boys would be having the time of their lives. A Space Marine Dreadnought is a treasure trove of advanced technology. The power systems alone would be worth years of study. The weapons are far more sophisticated than anything the Orks typically build. The armor is incredibly resilient, and the neural interface system, the mind impulse unit that connects pilot to machine, would be something completely outside Ork experience. They would want to take it all apart, understand how it works, and then rebuild it in a proper Orky fashion. This process of Ork reverse engineering is unique in the galaxy. They do not simply copy what they see. They do not follow instruction manuals or established procedures. Instead, they rely on their instinctive understanding of mechanics, combined with the reality warping effects of the WAR field. What emerges from an Ork workshop is never quite what went in. It is bigger, louder, covered in spikes and random armor plates, and bristling with additional weapons. It is also somehow functional, even when it absolutely should not be. The mech boys working on the Dreadnought would start making changes immediately. They would bolt on additional armor plating, not because it is necessary, but because more armor is always better. They would try to add more weapons, because more dakka is the Ork solution to every problem. They would paint it, probably in garish colors, with crude symbols and glyphs. They would add trophies from previous battles, dangling from chains and hooks. The elegant lines of the Contemptor chassis would disappear beneath layers of Ork modifications, turning it from a sophisticated war machine into a crude but powerful monstrosity. But here is where things get interesting. The pilot is still alive. The Orks have not killed them, because they are curious about this strange being, and because some of the mech boys have started to realize that the pilot is actually necessary for the Dreadnought to function properly. The mind impulse unit is not something they can easily replicate or replace. It requires a living brain, neurally connected to the machine, so the pilot becomes part of the project, incorporated into the Orks' plans, whether they want to be or not. This presents opportunities for our Alpha Legion warrior. If they are going to be part of this Ork war machine, then perhaps they can influence how it is built. Perhaps they can suggest modifications that seem to benefit the Orks, but actually create weaknesses they can exploit later. Perhaps they can convince the mech boys to include systems that would allow them to regain control, or at least send distress signals. Every interaction with their captors becomes a chance to plant seeds of confusion, to gain tiny advantages, to slowly work towards some kind of escape or rescue. The psychological warfare the pilot would wage is subtle and multi-layered. They would play on Ork rivalries, suggesting that one mech's ideas are better than another's. They would praise the most outlandish and dangerous modifications, knowing that the Orks will naturally gravitate toward the most explosive options. They would claim that certain Imperial technologies will not work without specific conditions being met, conditions that happen to create opportunities for sabotage. All of this would be done while appearing to be cooperative, even helpful. An Ork who thinks they have a useful prisoner is an Ork who keeps that prisoner alive. But the Orks are not as easy to manipulate as the pilot might hope. Their psychology is fundamentally different from that of humans or even other space marines. They do not feel fear the way others do. They do not worry about consequences or plan for the long term. They live in the moment, driven by their desire for a good fight and their love of creating bigger and louder weapons. Subtle manipulations that would work on a planetary governor or even a loyalist space marine, might go completely over an Ork's head. They are simultaneously more simple and more complex than they appear, driven by instincts coded into their very genes by their creators millions of years ago. The weeks turn into months, and the Dreadnought begins to take on its new form. It is barely recognizable now. The original Alpha Legion colors have been covered over with Ork glyphs and war paint. Additional weapons have been welded onto every available surface. Armor plates from a dozen different sources have been bolted on at random angles. There are chains, spikes, and trophies hanging from hooks. Massive exhaust pipes belch black smoke. And somewhere deep inside this mechanical monstrosity, barely visible beneath all the Ork modifications, the original sarcophagus remains, with its occupants still alive, still conscious, still plotting. The big mech in charge of the project has declared it his masterpiece. He calls it something in the Ork language that roughly translates to "da speaky stomper" or perhaps "da sneaky kilker," depending on which Ork you ask. The other mechs are jealous, which has led to several fights and at least one explosion. The Painboy who helped with the biological aspects has learned more about space marine physiology than any Ork has a right to know, which is concerning for reasons that go beyond just this one captured Dreadnought. And through it all, the pilot has been playing their long game, setting pieces in motion for a plan that might not come to fruition for months or even years. But all plans, no matter how clever, can be disrupted by simple chaos. And Ork camps are nothing if not chaotic. Rival warbands might attack. Internal power struggles might lead to the big mech being challenged and overthrown. Another prize might be brought in that draws attention away from the modified Dreadnought. Or perhaps, most dangerously, the Orks might actually try to use their new toy in battle, which would force the pilot to make terrible choices about how much to cooperate versus how much to resist. Consider what it would mean for an Alpha Legion warrior to be forced into combat as part of an Ork warband. They would be fighting against Imperial forces, or perhaps against other Chaos warbands, or maybe even against more Orks from a rival clan. Their weapons, now modified and enhanced with Ork technology, would be devastating. Their armor, thicker and heavier, would let them wade through enemy fire that would stop a normal Dreadnought, but they would not be in control. The Orks would be directing where they go and what they do. Their careful strategies and long-term plans would be meaningless in the face of simple Ork tactics, which usually amount to charge forward and shoot everything. This loss of agency would be perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire situation. A Dreadnought pilot is already trapped in a metal shell, cut off from the world they once knew. But at least they serve their legion, fighting in battles of their own choosing, working toward goals they understand. As an Ork war machine, they would be reduced to a tool, a weapon wielded by creatures they despise, forced to kill on behalf of a cause they do not believe in. Every battle would be a fresh humiliation, every victory for the Orks a defeat for their own honor. Yet, in this nightmare scenario, there might be one slim advantage. Ork technology is notoriously unstable. The modifications made to the Dreadnought, while impressive in their own crude way, would not be as reliable as the original Imperial technology. Systems would fail, weapons would jam. At the most critical moments, something would probably explode. And a cunning pilot, one who has spent months learning the ins and outs of their new mechanical body, might be able to exploit these failures. They might be able to engineer a catastrophic breakdown at just the right moment, one that would allow them to escape, or at least send a distress signal. The question of rescue adds another layer to this scenario. The Alpha Legion is not known for leaving their warriors behind, but they are also not known for straightforward rescue missions. If they detected that one of their dreadnoughts had been captured by Orks, their response would be characteristically complex. They might infiltrate the Ork warband with agents, slowly poisoning the leadership and creating confusion. They might arrange for a rival Ork faction to attack, using the chaos as cover for extraction. They might even wait, letting the situation develop. seeing if the captured pilot could turn their imprisonment into an intelligence-gathering opportunity. Or they might simply write off the loss. The Alpha Legion is ruthlessly practical. If the risk of rescue was too high, or if the strategic value of recovering one Dreadnought did not justify the resources required, they might leave their brother to his fate. This, too, would be a kind of torture for the pilot. The growing realization that no one is coming, that they truly are alone among the Orks, that their fate is sealed. The Alpha Legion trains its warriors to be independent, to think for themselves, to take initiative, but no one is trained to face the prospect of eternity as an Ork war machine. The physical toll of this ordeal would be immense. Even with the life support systems of the sarcophagus, even with the durability of space marine physiology, there are limits to what the pilot could endure. The crude modifications the Orks have made might interfere with the delicate balance of chemicals and nutrients that keep them alive. The constant physical stress of being used as a weapon, combined with the psychological trauma of their situation, would begin to wear them down. Space Marines are designed to endure unimaginable hardship, but they are not invincible. Eventually, even the strongest will break. But perhaps breaking is not the end of the story. Perhaps there is something worse than breaking. Consider what would happen if the pilot, after months or years of captivity, began to adapt to their situation. Not to accept it exactly, but to find a kind of equilibrium. They might develop a bitter respect for the Orks, for their straightforward approach to warfare, for their joy in battle. They might start to appreciate the crude effectiveness of Ork engineering, the way it just works, despite all reason saying it should not. They might even begin to take a kind of pride in their new form, this hybrid of Alpha Legion cunning and Ork brutality. This psychological adaptation would be its own kind of horror. The Alpha Legion prides itself on its sophistication, its refinement, its intellectual superiority. To be reduced to a tool of Ork warfare, and worse, to start accepting that role, would be a betrayal of everything they stand for. It would be proof that even the most carefully trained mind can be broken, given enough time and enough pressure. The pilot might start to forget what they are fighting for, might lose track of the complex webs of strategy and counter-strategy that defined their previous existence. In some ways, this would be worse than simple death or even permanent torture. Yet, we must also consider the impact this situation would have on the Orks themselves. They are not stupid, and they are capable of learning. Having an Alpha Legion Space Marine at their disposal, even an imprisoned one, would teach them things about the Imperium that they would not learn otherwise. They would learn about Space Marine technology, yes, but they might also learn about Space Marine psychology, about Imperial tactics, about the internal politics of the traitor legions. Every question they ask, every experiment they conduct, every conversation they have with their prisoner is an opportunity for information to leak out. This is particularly dangerous because Orks do not keep secrets the way other races do. What one Ork learns, they will brag about to other Orks. Those Orks will share the information with still more Orks. It spreads through the War like a contagion, and soon you have an entire Ork empire that knows more about fighting Space Marines than any Ork empire should. They might learn how Dreadnoughts are vulnerable to certain weapons. They might discover weaknesses in power armor. They might even grasp some rudimentary understanding of the tactics that different Space Marine chapters use. All of this makes them more dangerous, not just to the Alpha Legion, but to the Imperium as a whole. The Ork mech boys who worked on the captured Dreadnought would become famous among their kind. Other mechs would come from across the sector to see this marvel, this unique fusion of Imperial and Ork technology. They would study it, take measurements, argue about how it was done. Some would try to replicate the feat, capturing their own Space Marine vehicles and attempting their own modifications. The knowledge would spread, and with it, the danger would multiply. One captured Dreadnought is a tragedy for its chapter and a curiosity for the Orks. But if it becomes a template, If it teaches the Orks how to convert other captured Imperial machines, then it becomes a strategic disaster. There is also the question of what this modified Dreadnought could accomplish in battle. Ork technology, for all its crudeness, is often surprisingly effective. The added armor would make it more durable. The additional weapons would make it more deadly. The Ork force field generators that might be added would protect it in ways the original design never included. And underneath all of this, guiding it, would be a Space Marine pilot with thousands of years of combat experience. The combination would be formidable. It would be able to fight at the front of Ork warbands, leading charges, breaking through enemy lines, and surviving levels of damage that would destroy a normal Dreadnought. It would be a living nightmare for any Imperial forces that encountered it. Picture an Imperial Guard regiment that finds itself facing this monstrosity. They see what appears to be an Ork war machine, covered in crude symbols and bristling with oversized weapons. They prepare to fight it as they would any Ork construction, targeting obvious weak points, trying to overwhelm it with massed fire. But the machine does not move like an Ork vehicle. It moves with the precision and tactical awareness of a Space Marine. It anticipates their attacks, counters their strategies, exploits their weaknesses, and when they finally manage to damage it, when they tear away some of the Ork armor, they catch a glimpse of what lies beneath. The Hydra symbol of the Alpha Legion, the colors of a traitor. The realization of what they are fighting hits them like a physical blow, and in that moment of hesitation, the machine strikes, and they die. Or consider an Astartes chapter that encounters this hybrid abomination. They would see it as a desecration, a corruption of one of their most sacred war machines. They would fight with particular fury, determined to destroy this mockery and avenge their fallen brother. But fighting against a Dreadnought, even a modified one, is never easy. And if that Dreadnought is piloted by an Alpha Legion warrior, if it is using both Ork power and Astartes cunning, the battle becomes exponentially more difficult. The chapter would take casualties they did not expect, losses that would sting, and when the battle is over, whether they win or lose, they would be left with the disturbing knowledge that somewhere out there, the Orks have learned how to create more of these things. The captured pilot, forced to participate in these battles, would experience a complex mix of emotions. There would be shame at being used as a weapon against their former kind, even if they are traitors and care nothing for the Imperium. There would be satisfaction in demonstrating that even in captivity, they remain more than a match for their enemies. There would be hope that each battle brings new opportunities for escape or rescue. And there would be despair at the realization that they are becoming something new, something that is neither fully Alpha Legion nor fully Ork, but a nightmarish fusion of both. We must also consider the philosophical implications of this scenario. The Alpha Legion believes in adaptability, in doing whatever is necessary to achieve their goals. Their motto of Hydra Dominatus speaks to their ability to survive and thrive in any situation, to grow back stronger even when cut down. But what happens when adaptability goes too far? What happens when a warrior becomes so adapted to their circumstances that they lose sight of who they once were? The captured Dreadnought pilot represents this question taken to its extreme. They are adapting to survive, using their skills to manipulate their captors, finding ways to function in this new reality. But each adaptation, each compromise, each small victory earned through cooperation with the Orks moves them further from what they once were. The Space Marine chapters loyal to the Emperor would see this as just punishment for a traitor. The Alpha Legion sided with Horus during the heresy, turned their backs on the Emperor, and embraced the darkness. To suffer now at the hands of Xenos is simply the natural consequence of their betrayal. But from the perspective of the Alpha Legion itself, this is a strategic setback, a loss of a valuable asset, and potentially a security risk if the pilot knows information that could compromise ongoing operations. The question of whether to attempt rescue or simply eliminate the threat becomes a calculation of costs and benefits, with no consideration given to loyalty or brotherhood. This is the way of the Alpha Legion. Everything is part of the plan. Everyone is expendable if the situation demands it. For the pilot themselves, the question of faith becomes paramount. Do they still believe in whatever cause led them to side with the Alpha Legion in the first place? Do they still hold to the Legion's creed of independence and self-reliance? Or has their captivity stripped away those beliefs, leaving only a desperate desire to survive by any means necessary? The psychological journey from proud warrior to prisoner to something neither fully prisoner nor fully free would be fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. Each day would bring new challenges, new humiliations, new decisions about how much to compromise and how much to resist. Let us imagine a specific scenario, one that illustrates the full horror and complexity of this situation. The Ork warband that holds the captured Dreadnought has decided to attack an Imperial world. This is a large-scale assault involving hundreds of thousands of Orks and dozens of looted vehicles. The modified Dreadnought is given a place of honor in the vanguard because the warboss thinks it looks impressive, and because the big mech who built it has been boasting about its capabilities. The pilot, strapped into their sarcophagus, deep inside the machine, knows exactly what is about to happen. They can see through the crude optical sensors that have been added to their chassis. They can hear the Orks preparing for battle, their excited chatter, their war cries. As the attack begins, the pilot is forced to march with the Ork horde. They wade through defensive fire that would make a normal Ork vehicle pause, their heavy armor shrugging off hits that would destroy lesser machines. They fire their weapons, modified Ork guns that are barely controlled explosions, at Imperial Guard positions. They watch as their shots tear through sandbag fortifications and turn human soldiers into red mist. They feel, through their mechanical senses, the impact of enemy fire against their hull. And all the while, they are analyzing the battle, looking for opportunities, trying to find a way to turn this disaster to their advantage. Perhaps they see an opportunity in the chaos. Perhaps they identify a weakness in the Ork attack plan, something they can exploit. They subtly adjust their course, moving in a direction that seems to support the Ork assault, but actually leads them toward a less defended position. They open fire on targets that seem tactically important, but are actually strategic dead ends. They plant seeds of confusion in the Ork chain of command by claiming to see enemies where there are none, or by failing to report actual threats. It is a delicate dance, because if they are too obvious, the Orks will realize they are being manipulated. But if they are too subtle, their actions will have no effect. Then something happens. An Imperial ship in orbit manages to punch through the Ork air defenses and launch an orbital strike. The plasma bombardment turns the battlefield into an inferno. The Orks scatter, their attack broken, their formation in chaos. And in that moment, the Dreadnought pilots seize their chance. They turn their weapons not on the Imperial forces, but on the Ork vehicles around them. They fire everything they have, destroying transports and artillery in seconds before the Orks even realize what is happening. Then they charge, not toward the Imperial lines, but away, into the wastes beyond the battlefield, moving as fast as their modified legs can carry them. The escape would not be clean. Ork vehicles would pursue, weapons blazing. The pilot would take hits, feel systems failing, know that they are pushing their already stressed machine beyond its limits. But they would also feel something they have not felt in months: hope. Even if they die in this attempt, even if they are recaptured or destroyed, for these few moments they are free. They are in control of their own actions again. They are no longer a tool, but a warrior. But perhaps escape is not what happens. Perhaps instead, the pilot realizes that this battle presents a different kind of opportunity. If they cooperate with the Orks, if they help win this fight, they might secure a more privileged position. They might be given more autonomy, more access to information and resources. They might be able to work their way into a position where escape or rescue becomes more feasible. So they fight alongside the Orks, using their superior tactical knowledge to turn the tide of battle, helping to break through Imperial defenses and secure victory. And afterward, when the Orks are celebrating, when the big mech is praising his creation, the pilot is already planning their next move, thinking 3 steps ahead, playing the long game that the Alpha Legion is so famous for. Or perhaps the situation goes in an entirely different direction. Perhaps the modified Dreadnought becomes so successful, so valuable to the Ork war boss, that other Ork factions become jealous. Rival mechs might try to steal or sabotage it. Other war bosses might challenge the current boss for ownership of this prize. The Dreadnought and its pilot become a piece on a larger game board, fought over by Orks who do not even see them as a person, but only as a weapon. The pilot would have to navigate these complex political waters, using their skills to ensure they do not end up in the hands of someone even worse than their current captors. There is also the possibility of discovery by other forces. Word of the Orks' unusual war machine would spread. Imperial intelligence might catch wind of it. Other Chaos warbands might take interest. The Eldar, always watching for threats to their own plans, might decide this hybrid abomination needs to be eliminated. Each of these factions would approach the situation differently, creating layers of complexity that the trapped pilot would have to navigate. They would go from being a prisoner of Orks to being a target of multiple factions, all while still trapped in their mechanical shell, still unable to escape their situation through their own power alone. The psychological toll would mount with each passing month. The pilot would feel their sense of self beginning to fragment. They would catch themselves thinking in Ork terms, planning in Ork timeframes. They would feel a strange pride when the Orks' crude modifications actually work in battle. They would find themselves respecting the big mech's ingenuity, even as they despise everything about their situation. This is what long-term captivity does. It breaks down the barriers between captor and captive. It blurs the lines of identity. It makes the abnormal become normal. And for a space marine, whose sense of self is tied so completely to their legion and their mission, this kind of psychological erosion is perhaps more damaging than any physical torture. Imagine the pilot during the quiet moments, when they are not in battle, when the mech workshop has closed for the night, when the Ork camp is as quiet as it ever gets. They would have time to think, to remember. They would recall their life before internment, when they had a body of flesh and blood. They would remember their first missions as a full battle brother of the Alpha Legion, the pride they felt in their legion's colors, the bonds they formed with their squad. They would think about the heresy, about the choices that led them to side against the Emperor, and they would wonder if this is their punishment, if this nightmare of captivity and modification is what they deserve for turning traitor. But then the morning would come, and the Orks would return, and the cycle would continue. More modifications, more battles, more small victories and devastating setbacks. The pilot would adapt, survive, endure, because that is what Space Marines do. They endure. Even in the darkest circumstances, even when hope seems lost, they continue to fight. It is coded into their very genes, reinforced by their training, made absolute by their indoctrination. A Space Marine does not give up. A Space Marine does not surrender. And so the pilot would keep planning, keep looking for opportunities, keep believing that somehow, someday, they will find a way out of this nightmare. Let us also consider the impact on the Alpha Legion as a whole. Losing a Dreadnought is losing not just a war machine, but also centuries or even millennia of accumulated knowledge and experience. The pilot would have known things that no one else knew, would have remembered battles that no other living soul could recall. That knowledge is now in Ork hands, or at least potentially accessible to them. The security implications are staggering. The Alpha Legion would have to assume that everything their captured brother knew has been compromised. They would need to change codes, alter safe houses, abandon long-term plans that the pilot had been part of. The ripple effects of a single capture could compromise operations across entire sectors. Moreover, there is the symbolic damage. The Alpha Legion operates on perception and reputation as much as on actual military force. They are feared because they are mysterious, because they could be anyone, because you never truly know if you have beaten them or if losing was part of their plan all along. But a captured dreadnought, especially one that has been turned into an Ork war machine, damages that mystique. It shows that the Alpha Legion can be beaten, can be humiliated, can be reduced to tools in the hands of their enemies. Other forces would see this and take heart. Orks would be emboldened to try the same trick again. The Alpha Legion's carefully cultivated reputation for invincibility would suffer a blow that would take years to repair. The question of rescue becomes more urgent as time passes. If the Alpha Legion is going to act, they need to do so before the situation becomes permanent, before their brother is too integrated into the Ork warband, before too much sensitive information has been extracted. But planning a rescue operation against Orks is notoriously difficult. Ork camps are chaotic and unpredictable. Security is inconsistent, sometimes surprisingly tight, sometimes laughably lax. Infiltrating an Ork warband is nearly impossible for non-Orks, because Orks have a psychic sense for their own kind and will immediately identify outsiders. And even if you could get in, even if you could locate the captured dreadnought, extracting it would require force that would alert the entire camp. The Alpha Legion might decide on a more indirect approach. They could arrange for rival Ork factions to attack, using the resulting chaos as cover for an extraction team. They could infiltrate the Imperial forces that the Orks are fighting against, positioning loyalist space marines to capture the dreadnought during battle, and then arranging its quiet disappearance afterward. They could even make contact with their imprisoned brother, sending coded messages hidden in Ork communications or in the debris of battles, establishing a line of communication that would allow coordinated escape attempts. Each of these approaches would be risky, complex, and require extensive preparation, but these are exactly the kinds of operations that the Alpha Legion excels at. Alternatively, the Alpha Legion might take a darker path. If rescue is impossible or too costly, elimination becomes the logical choice. They cannot allow their brother to remain a tool of the Orks, cannot risk what he might reveal or what he might become. So they send assassins, not to rescue, but to kill. A long-range weapon, a bomb planted in the mech workshop, a saboteur who damages critical systems so that the dreadnought explodes during its next battle. Any of these methods could be used to end the pilot's suffering and eliminate the security risk. It would be a mercy killing, they would tell themselves, a necessary act to protect the Legion. But for the pilot, betrayed by those they served, killed by their own brothers rather than rescued, it would be the final and most terrible blow. What if the pilot themselves decides on this course of action? What if, after months or years of captivity, after exhausting every possibility for escape, they decide that death is preferable to continued existence as an Ork weapon? Space Marines have the capacity to end their own lives through various implants and biological triggers. A dreadnought pilot might have the ability to deliberately overload their reactor, to initiate a cascade failure that would destroy them and everything around them. It would be a final act of defiance, a way to take control of their own fate one last time. The explosion would kill the Orks working on them, destroy their entire chassis, and wipe out any possibility of the Orks learning more from their remains. But self-destruction goes against the core programming of a Space Marine. They are created to survive, to fight, to serve. Taking their own life, even in the most dire circumstances, is a betrayal of that programming. The pilot would have to overcome millennia of conditioning, would have to decide that their death serves the Legion better than their continued existence, would have to accept that they have finally reached the point where there is no hope left. It would be an act of tremendous will, and potentially one of the most tragic moments imaginable in this scenario. The final thought passing through the pilot's mind as they trigger the overload would not be of relief or peace, but of failure, of the acknowledgement that they were not cunning enough, not strong enough, not resourceful enough to overcome their circumstances. There is one final scenario we must consider, one that is perhaps the darkest of all. What if the pilot does not seek rescue? What if, after enough time has passed, after enough adaptation and change, they decide that their new existence is acceptable? Not comfortable, not desired, but acceptable. They have found a kind of purpose in serving the Orks, have discovered that they can still fight, can still be effective, can still experience something approaching the joy of battle. They have become a hybrid creature, part space marine, part Ork war machine, loyal to neither but serving both. When rescue finally comes, when the Alpha Legion finally arrives to extract or eliminate them, they refuse. They fight back. They have become so integrated into the Ork warband that they would rather stay than return to the cold politics and endless deception of their former legion. This transformation would be the ultimate horror, the proof that even the most carefully trained mind can be broken and reshaped by circumstance. The Alpha Legion would be forced to kill their own brother, not because he has betrayed them to the Orks, but because he has become something that is neither one thing nor the other, a creature that fits nowhere in the galaxy's existing categories. And the pilot, in those final moments before they are destroyed by their former brothers, might feel something approaching peace. They would die as themselves, unique and irreplaceable, rather than as just another faceless warrior of a legion that values anonymity above all else. Of course, there are technological limitations and complications we should address. Dreadnought sarcophagi are incredibly sophisticated pieces of technology, designed by the finest artificers of the Imperium and maintained through rituals that blend technical knowledge with religious devotion. The Orks, for all their instinctive engineering genius, do not have access to this knowledge. They do not understand the sacred oils and unguents that must be applied. They do not know the proper prayers to the machine spirits. They cannot read the high Gothic inscriptions that detail maintenance procedures. This means that even if they can make the Dreadnought function, even if they can add their own improvements, they cannot properly maintain it. Over time, this would lead to degradation. Systems would fail in ways the Orks cannot fix. The life support equipment keeping the pilot alive would begin to malfunction. The neural interface would develop glitches, causing pain or sensory distortion. The pilot would feel their mechanical body slowly dying around them, would know that each battle might be their last. Not because of enemy action, but because the machine that is their body is finally giving out. They would be racing against time, trying to achieve some goal, some victory, some escape, before the inevitable end comes. The Orks would try to fix these problems, of course. They would jury-rig solutions, bolting on additional life support systems, rerouting neural pathways through crude bypass systems, trying to keep their prize functional. But these fixes would only delay the inevitable. Without proper knowledge, without the right tools and materials, without the ritualistic maintenance that space marine technology requires, the Dreadnought would eventually fail completely. The pilot would be left in the worst possible situation, still conscious, still aware, but trapped in a metal coffin that can no longer move, can no longer fight, can no longer do anything but slowly run down its remaining power reserves while they wait for the end. In this final stage, the pilot might finally find a kind of peace. All the planning, all the manipulation, all the desperate attempts to escape or rescue would be over. They would have time to reflect on their life, on the choices that led them here, on what it all meant. They might think about the Alpha Legion's motto, Hydra Dominatus, and wonder if they ever truly understood what it meant. They might remember their Primarch, whichever of the twins they served under, and wonder if Alpharius or Omegon would be proud or disappointed by how their story ended. They might even, in those final moments, feel gratitude for the life they lived, however strange and difficult it was, because they got to experience things that few beings in the galaxy ever would. And then, finally, the power would run out. The last flickers of consciousness would fade. The pilot would slip into a darkness that, this time, would be final and absolute. The Orks would be disappointed to lose their toy, might try to restart it a few times, might argue about what went wrong, but eventually they would accept that it is dead, that whatever magic animated it is gone, and they would strip it for parts to use in other projects. The pilot's remains would be discarded or, more likely, added to some pain boy's collection of interesting specimens. And that would be the end of the story, a final indignity for a warrior who once served as a terror weapon of the Alpha Legion. Unless, of course, this is all part of a larger plan. Unless the capture was intentional, a deep cover operation so secret that even the pilot did not know they were part of it. Unless the months of apparent captivity were actually months of intelligence gathering, of studying Ork technology and psychology, of positioning themselves for some grand revelation or coup that would benefit the Alpha Legion's inscrutable goals. With the Alpha Legion, you can never be sure. Every apparent defeat might be a hidden victory. Every tragedy might be a carefully planned strategy. The pilot's death might not be the end, but merely the transition to the next phase of an operation that was planned decades ago and will not reach its conclusion for decades more. This uncertainty, this inability to ever know the truth, is perhaps the most Alpha Legion thing about this entire scenario. Even in death, even in defeat, even in the worst fate imaginable, there remains the possibility that it was all intentional, all part of the plan, all serving some greater purpose that only the Alpha Legion understands. And whether that possibility brings comfort or horror depends entirely on your perspective. For the Imperium, it is a nightmare. The thought that even this disaster might somehow benefit their enemies. For the Orks, it is irrelevant, because they got to play with an interesting toy for a while, and that is all that matters to them. And for the pilot, if any shred of consciousness remains in whatever comes after, it might be the only comfort available, the belief that their suffering served a purpose, that their sacrifice was meaningful, that in some way they cannot understand, they achieved victory even in defeat. The story of a captured Alpha Legion Dreadnought is ultimately a story about adaptation, about survival in impossible circumstances, about the limits of cleverness and the power of simple brutality. It is a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, even the most sophisticated plans can be undone by simple chaos. The Alpha Legion's cunning, legendary throughout the galaxy, means nothing when confronted with Orks who do not think in terms of long-term strategy or subtle manipulation. Their Dreadnought, a war machine that has survived for millennia, can be reduced to a crude toy in the hands of Xenos who understand machines but not sophistication. Yet it is also a story about the indomitable nature of the Space Marine spirit. Even trapped, even tortured, even modified beyond recognition, the pilot continues to think, to plan, to seek advantage. They do not simply surrender to their fate. They adapt, they survive, they look for opportunities. This is the legacy of the Emperor's genetic engineering, the gift and curse of being created as a weapon that never stops fighting, that can never truly rest. Whether this persistence is admirable or tragic depends on your point of view. From one angle, it is the highest expression of duty and dedication. From another, it is a form of slavery, a biological programming so deep that it persists even when freedom has become impossible. The scenario forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about identity and transformation. At what point does modification become so extreme that the original person is gone? If the Alpha Legion pilot's body is mostly Ork technology, if their daily life is spent among Orks, if their actions serve Ork goals, are they still a Space Marine of the Alpha Legion? Or have they become something new, something hybrid, something that fits into neither category? These questions have no easy answers, which is part of what makes this scenario so compelling and so disturbing. For the Orks, the captured Dreadnought is a triumph, proof that they can take on the Imperium's greatest warriors and come out on top. For the Alpha Legion, it is a disaster, a security breach, and a symbolic defeat that damages their carefully maintained reputation. For the Imperium as a whole, it is a warning. Evidence that the Orks are more dangerous than they appear, capable of learning and adapting in ways that threaten Imperial superiority. And for the captured pilot, it is everything. It is their entire world, their reality, the situation they must navigate every moment of every day. They are not just a piece in a larger game. They are a person, trapped in circumstances beyond their control, doing everything in their power to survive and maintain some shred of dignity and purpose. In the end, whether through escape, rescue, death, or transformation, the pilot's story would become legend. Other Space Marines would hear of it and shudder. Ork mech boys would hear of it and dream of replicating the feat. Alpha Legion operatives would study it, looking for lessons about survival in impossible circumstances, about the limits of their methods, about what happens when their carefully laid plans encounter the simple chaos of the universe. And somewhere, in the vast archives of the Imperium, a notation would be made. A Dreadnought lost, a warrior fallen, another tragedy in a galaxy that has seen trillions upon trillions of tragedies, each one as individual and as meaningless as the last. But the impact would not be limited to just records and legends. Somewhere, on some battlefield, months or years after the capture, an Imperial commander would face an Ork warband and notice something unusual about one of their war machines. It moves differently. It fights smarter. It seems to anticipate tactics in ways Ork machines should not. And in that moment of recognition, as they realize what they are facing, as they understand the implications, they would feel a cold fear settle into their hearts. Because if the Orks can do this once, they can do it again. If they have learned to capture and convert Space Marine dreadnoughts, what else might they learn? What other Imperial technologies might they appropriate? What new horrors might they unleash? This fear would not be irrational. It would be based on a very real danger. Each captured Imperial machine is a lesson for the Orks, a template they can study and replicate. Each victory teaches them new tactics, new strategies, new possibilities. The Orks may seem crude and simple, but they are survivors from the war in heaven, weapons created by the old ones to fight the most terrible war the galaxy has ever known. They are genetically engineered for war, and that includes the capacity to adapt and improve. Underestimating them has been the downfall of countless civilizations, and the capture of an Alpha Legion dreadnought is exactly the kind of success that could teach them to aim higher, to try for bigger prizes, to become even more dangerous than they already are. So we return to where we started, with our trapped warrior in their mechanical shell, surrounded by Orks, looking for any opportunity to escape, or at least to make their captivity count for something. This is the reality of war in the 41st millennium. There are no happy endings. There are no clean victories. There is only survival, adaptation, and the hope that your suffering serves some larger purpose. For a Space Marine of the Alpha Legion, that purpose is supposed to be the Legion's inscrutable plans, the great games they play across the galaxy. But for a Dreadnought pilot in Ork captivity, that purpose might simply be surviving one more day, resisting one more modification, planning one more escape attempt that will probably fail, but might, just might, succeed. Remember to like and subscribe to Stories of Hammer for more deep dives into the darkest corners of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We bring you the stories that others fear to tell, the scenarios that wake up loyalists and traitors alike in cold sweats. The grim darkness of the far future is full of horrors, but it is also full of stories worth telling, stories of survival against impossible odds, of warriors who refuse to surrender even when surrender would be a mercy. This has been the story of what happens when Orks capture an Alpha Legion dreadnought alive. It is not a story with a happy ending, because in the 41st millennium, there are no happy endings. There is only war, and those who endure it, and the terrible things that are done in the name of survival. The galaxy is vast and full of nightmares. This is just one of them.